have too much time.
No.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this Brown Bank lunch seminar, which we have every Tuesday in MF. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Joseph Scales, who is a Marie Sklodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow funded by Horizon Europe, and he's based in University of Agder. Today's presentation, Judith's Murder Mystery, is part of his larger postdoc research project entitled Fighting Talk, Motivating Violence in Ancient Judaism. And you know the format of this discussion. You are getting some 13 minutes to present your stuff, and then we open the floor for questions and comments. And when you have comments, please use the microphone. Okay, please.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. Can everyone hear me? First of all, we're okay. I'm going to try and talk from notes, as 13 minutes is quite a tight time frame, and I'm given to often ramble about things. But just to introduce a bit of the background for this first, as kindly introduced, I'm currently in the midst of a postdoctoral project where I'm thinking specifically about pre-battle speeches in ancient Judaism. And one of the texts I look at is the Book of Judith, so I'll be talking a bit more about that today. And I'm currently also in the midst of preparing another research project proposal, which is going to think about violence a bit more broadly than just in this kind of specific topos of speeches. So to begin, Judith Murder Mystery is based on an article that is currently out waiting reviews. We'll see how that comes back, but I thought I'd share some of the results with you and see if that's of interest. And who doesn't like talking about Judith all the time? So let's do that. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Book of Judith, I'll say a few things about the book just to introduce it. It's an apocryphal book, maybe in two senses. So in a technical sense, it exists in the Apocrypha of the Old Testament, maintains a place in Catholic canon, but also has kind of fallen out. So it's one of these so-called deuterocanonical works. And then it's also apocryphal in a more colloquial sense, in that it's kind of a legendary story. It's not intended to be read as literal history. So Judith begins in the first line with confusing us about the nature of the situation. So it tells us that the king is Nebuchadnezzar, that famous Babylonian king, but he rules over the Assyrians in Nineveh. She also said, or the book also says, that at this time the Israelites have returned from exile, but Nineveh has already fallen in the 7th century. So there's a lot of, let's say, intentional confusion about when this takes place, and that's deliberate to convey that this is not a story strictly about history. So it kind of appears to be of the 2nd century BCE, written around then. As far as we know, it's written perhaps in Greek, although there's been a lot of argument back and forth over the original language, maybe Hebrew. It's got a lot of features of Hebrew, so the author's clearly familiar with lots of other texts we know preserved in the Hebrew Bible. And because the protagonist is Judith, this very strong character, it's drawn a bit of, or quite a lot of attention from many, many different viewpoints, but in particular feminist readings and feminist analysis. So this paper sits somewhat in dialogue with some of the things that have come out from those particular readings, which focus on some of the more negative or unsavory aspects of Judith. As we'll see in the overview of the story, she undertakes some actions which we might disagree with from certain perspectives. So is she really a hero? Is she not? And what I'm going to try and present is that from Judith's own words, she is making a very clear moral case for what she is about to do. So just as an overview of the story, the aforementioned Nebuchadnezzar, he's king. He wants to rule over more territory, demands more tribute, and sends out his army of Assyrians under General Holofernes to exact tribute over all of the Mesopotamia. And when he rocks up in the Levant region, he encounters kind of a problem. So the only access into Judea or the area around Jerusalem is through this single valley, at the head of which stands this town, Bethulia. So again, it's imaginative geography. There isn't really such a place, but it constructs this space wherein this place is really significant strategically. Holofernes is kind of unable to convince them to surrender initially, so besieges the town of Bethulia for 40 days, and over the course of which the townspeople become very thirsty from lack of water, and they cry out to their elders to surrender. There's a bit of back and forth discussion, and essentially the town's leadership agree to surrender within 5 days' time if they don't receive divine assistance. So this is the situation we're in, quite desperate straits. And only at this point, 8th chapter in only 16 chapters of the book, the protagonist Judith is finally introduced. And she is introduced as this very pious woman. She's a widow of a wealthy man. She's got a really strong lineage with lots of kind of significant names. And she observes all these kind of particular Jewish customs and ideas. And Judith hears what has been agreed amongst the leaders of the town and the townspeople, and is very outraged. So the first thing we hear from her own mouth is this long, extended, quite theological speech that essentially attacks the elders in many ways for having decided to surrender. Importantly, there's these 2 verses in the speech, in chapter 8, verses 21 and 22. And this is kind of the crux of her argument, the consequences of what will happen should the town fall. So Judith says, for in the event that we be taken, also all Judea will fall, and our holy precincts will be plundered, and he will require its desecration by our blood. Some manuscripts read mouth. And among the nations he will bring upon our head the murder of our brothers, the captivity of the land, the waste of our inheritance, where if we be enslaved, we shall also become as offense and a disgrace before our owners. So there's lots of thematic elements going on in this kind of justification. In order to rescue the town, Judith then makes this plan to infiltrate the Assyrian camp. She's given leave to kind of come and go as she will, and over the course of 3 days, essentially arrive at the situation where she can assassinate the general Holofernes. She does so, escapes the camp, his head in bag, and the next morning the Bethulians come down from the town and rout the Assyrians. So it's a mass rout, general slaughter. All the Israelites from the surrounding regions, many places such as Samaria, Galilee, so on and so forth, come out, join in the general destruction, and then they all go up to Jerusalem with their plunder and loot in hand and dedicate this at the temple. So that's the overall story. Judith ends up praised, she retires, she lives a long life, and it ends in a very similar way to passages in the book of Judges, where the land is kind of at peace for all the days of her life. So going back to those 2 verses I read, we'll pull apart some elements. And the first 2 I want to focus on are among the nations, and he will bring upon our head. So both of these are common tropes we find in lots of biblical literature, or figures of speech. They're throughout the Hebrew Bible, and they're also in subsequent ancient Jewish literature. And being shamed amongst the nations is this kind of notion that's found in lots of prophetic material like Isaiah, Joel, Ezekiel, where a failure of the people is witnessed by the nation. So these nations form a kind of shaming audience that the wrongdoing is almost revealed before them. And they take quite an important role, particularly in passages like Ezekiel 16. It's a rather infamous passage that describes Jerusalem as this shamed woman's body. So we're dealing with a wider framework here as well that I just want to signpost but won't go into, which are dynamics of gender and shaming, but this is also throughout. And the other, let's say, trope is bringing it on the head. And again, we find this kind of language spaced throughout prophetic books, but also beyond, such as in 1 Samuel, 1 Kings, Nehemiah. And generally, again, this is the idea that there is a specific wrongdoing, that the deity turns back on the wrongdoers. We'll put a pin in that idea of turning back just for a minute. The crux of the idea that Judith raises and states here is the murder of our brothers. So what does she mean by this? Murder perhaps seems almost self-evident, but if we unpick what's going on behind, there's some really specific vocabulary that's being used. So Greek here is phonos, this particular term that often means wholesale slaughter in the translated Hebrew Bible, throughout the Septuagint, many other Jewish works such as Josephus. But it also conveys a really specific sense of a legal responsibility or a legal liability for having done something quite specific. So this charge also stands out quite unique in the wider context of the book of Judith, because amongst all the other threats that Judith says, or all the other consequences she identifies, this one almost stands alone as something which isn't turned around on the Assyrians. So she talks about them plundering, she talks about wasting of inheritance, she talks about captivity. Throughout the book, so Nebuchadnezzar's original threats in chapter 2, threats identified by people in Jerusalem in chapter 4, and in Judith's song in chapter 16, all of these ideas are they come up again and again. And ultimately, the Assyrians threaten this, but they become the ones who are ultimately undone, except for murder. All of the terms that Judith uses for this are kind of somewhat more loose. So instead, the armies of the Assyrians are overrun or they're struck down. Even Holofernes has his head taken away, just kind of a little bit more roundabout way than actually what perhaps has happened. So thinking about this term phonos, which Judith, the book never uses to describe the actions of the Israelites, we see this in two significant places in the Pentateuch. In Exodus 22, 1-2, the owner of a house is not liable for a charge of phonos if a thief has broken in the night and in the morning is discovered dead. So essentially, this is kind of thinking about specific responsibility of things where you may or may not be liable for this really particular charge of murder or homicide. And the other one that kind of conveys some more meaning around this, how I think Judith might be using it, is Deuteronomy 22:8, where a builder of a house has to construct a parapet around it, because if someone falls, then the owner will be not liable for this charge of phonos. So essentially, you have to, in both cases, there are certain conditions that a person may fulfill or fail to fulfill that will result in this really specific charge. And in both cases, it's to do with your liability towards other people, particularly in Deuteronomy 22. It's the sense of a responsibility to prevent unnecessary deaths of another. So, returning to Judith, I think there's a small observation to be made in the sense of emphasis. In this passage, I don't think Judith is saying generally it's a good thing to prevent murder of innocents or others, but I think she's making a really specific legal claim upon her audience, where she says, if you fail, then the resulting murder is your responsibility. In effect, you have committed this murder. So there's something going on here when we think about violence broadly in Judith. And instead of criticizing her perhaps for taking violent means into her own hands, Judith herself is making a case where there are almost two options, both of which are violence. On the one hand, the Bethulians, her audience, become responsible for a charge of murder of those in Jerusalem. On the other hand, she takes matters into her own hand and they strike down the Assyrians or do all these kind of lesser charges. So I think this terminology kind of shows us that the book of Judith has a slightly different concept of violence to how we might tend to think of it as modern readers in the context of wider ancient Jewish texts that discuss this kind of ideas. I think that's 13 minutes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this fine presentation.